French toast and French fries, the Frenchiest of all Frenchness. But were either of these things actually invented by the French, or is this just one of the many ways in which the French like to make themselves seem important to history, when in fact we all know that humanity would just be better off without them? Jesus. Woo! First, let's talk about French toast, shall we? French toast was not invented in France. In fact, French toast was around long before France even existed as a country. The exact origins of French toast are unknown, but it isn't surprising that humans seem to have come up with the recipe quickly, given that French toast is traditionally made out of stale bread. Bread has been a staple food for most cultures since food first began being prepared, and up until very recently, the vast majority of humans would have never dreamed of wasting any food. Thus, one has to find a way to make stale bread palatable. God, I'm glad we live in the future where we can just throw as much stuff away as we want. Oh god. Soaking it in milk and egg, then cooking it seems logical enough, making a good and tasty meal while not wasting any precious stale bread. The earliest reference to doing just this dates all the way back to the 4th century in Rome, in a cookbook attributed to Apicius, and it is thought to predate this work by a good margin. This style of French toast was called pan dulcis. The Romans would take the bread and soak it in milk and egg mixture and then cook it, typically frying it in oil or butter, pretty much just like it's made today in many countries around the world. In the UK, I'm pretty sure we call this eggy bread, or was that just my upbringing? The practice became common throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. Also, maybe just as Brits, we just don't like naming things after the French. This practice became common throughout Europe in the Middle Ages, including making it primarily out of stale bread. Indeed, the name of French toast in France itself is pain perdu, which literally means lost bread. It is also called this in Belgium, New Orleans, Acadiana, Newfoundland, and the Congo, among other places. It's interesting to note for the naysayers who like to cling to the belief that it came from France that before the French called it pain perdu, they called it pain à la romaine, or Roman bread. Another popular myth as to the origins of the name French toast, perpetuated in such publications as Why Do Donuts Serve Holes, is that French toast actually came from America, specifically being created in 1724. The name French came from the chef who first made it, Joseph French. Supposedly, Mr. French was bad at grammar, and when he named it, simply forgot the apostrophe, as in French's toast without the apostrophe instead of French's toast with the apostrophe. Alas, if only the grammar Nazis of the day would have corrected him. Hero grammar Nazis, thank you so much. This story, of course, is pure fiction, as there are numerous references throughout history of what is now called in North America French toast. Indeed, there are numerous cookbooks from the Middle Ages throughout Europe that even give the classical recipes for French toast. Further, the name French toast predates the 18th century, with the earliest references popping up in the mid-17th century before the story of the grammatically inept Joseph French. Before that time, it was also known as German toast, Spanish toast, and a variety of other names, only some of which had anything to do with the name of a country. As to why North Americans call it French toast, this is thought to be simply that this particular food item was popularized in America by French immigrants. So, with that out of the way, let's move on to French fries. Exactly who introduced these golden strips of goodness to the world is not entirely known. Among the various hypotheses, it's generally accepted that the French fry was invented by either the Belgians or the French. Potatoes were first introduced to Europe not through the French or Belgians, but rather through the Spanish. In 1537, Jimenez de Quesada and his Spanish forces encountered a village in Colombia where all the natives had fled. Among other things, they found in the natives' foodstuffs potatoes, which the Spanish initially called truffles. Around 20 years later, potatoes were brought back to Spain and introduced to Italy. At this time, the potatoes were quite small and bitter and didn't grow well in either Spain or Italy. However, over time, larger and less bitter versions of the plant were cultivated, and the plant gradually caught on elsewhere in Europe, though it was initially met with quite a bit of resistance. For example, when the potato was first introduced to Ireland and Scotland, some Protestants objected due to the fact that the potato wasn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. Thus, it wasn't clear whether it was acceptable to eat, so they refused to eat the plant at first. Religion. The Catholics, on the other hand, chose to sprinkle them with holy water before planting, thus making them acceptable to plant and eat. Of course. In any event, historical accounts indicate that the Belgians were possibly frying up thin strips of potatoes as early as the late 17th century, though some claim it wasn't until the late 18th century in the Meuse Valley between Dinant and Liège in Belgium. How they supposedly came up with the idea was that in this area it was very common for the people to fry up small fish as a staple for their meals. However, when the rivers froze up thick enough, it tended to make it somewhat difficult to get to said fish. So instead of frying up fish in these times, they would cut up potatoes in long thin slices and fry them up just like they did to the fish. Giving some credence to this story is that the Spanish controlled much of what is now modern-day Belgium at the time the Spanish introduced the potato to Europe. So, at least the Belgians were probably among the first to have a crack at the potato in terms of thinking up ways to prepare food from potatoes. Okay, so now let's move on to the French argument. The popularity of the potato in France is largely credited to French army medical officer called Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, who very famously championed the potato throughout France and parts of Europe. During the 7 Years' War, Parmentier was taken captive. As a part of his prison rations, he was given potatoes. At this time, the French had previously used potatoes only for hog feed and had never eaten them. The reason is that some people thought potatoes caused various diseases. In fact, in 1748, the French Parliament even banned cultivation of potatoes as they were convinced that potatoes caused leprosy. However, while in prison in Prussia, Parmentier was forced to cultivate and eat potatoes and found that the French notions about the potato, well, they were just false. No leprosy there. When he came back to France, Parmentier began championing the potato as a potential food source. Finally, in 1772, the Paris Faculty of Medicine proclaimed that potatoes were edible for humans, though Parmentier still encountered significant resistance and wasn't even allowed to grow the potatoes in his garden at the Invalides Hospital, where he worked as a pharmacist. Parmentier then began a more aggressive campaign to promote the potato in France, hosting dinners featuring potatoes with such notable dignitaries as Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, King Louis XVI, and Queen Marie Antoinette. He would also hire armed guards to surround his potato patch to try to convince people that what was in the patch was very valuable. He would then tell the guards to accept any bribes they were offered by people and let them steal the potatoes. In the end, though, it took a famine in 1785 for the potato to become popular in France. Once the French accepted the potato, though, its popularity skyrocketed in Europe. By 1795, potatoes were being grown on a very large scale in France, including in the raw gardens where they were converted into potato fields. Within that span of time, the French either invented or learned to make fries. Once discovered/invented, French fries became extremely popular in France, particularly in Paris, where they were sold by pushcart vendors on the streets and called frites. Now, it should be noted that this all happens in the late 18th century, which was as much as 100 years after some historians think that the Belgians were supposedly already making French fries. However, given the scant hard evidence, it is possible that the French were actually first. It should also be noted that shortly before the potato became popular in France, the Franco-Austrian War was going on, also known as the War of Austrian Succession, much of which took place around modern-day Belgium. So it's possible that the French soldiers were introduced to fries by the Belgians at this time, and a couple of decades later, when the potato became popular in France, these former soldiers then introduced the preparation method to the rest of France. Or it's possible that the French came up with the idea on their own and spread them to Belgium around that time, or that both came up with the idea independently. Whatever the case, it was the French who seemed to be the ones that spread fries to America and Britain, and it, in turn, was the Americans through fast food chains that eventually popularly introduced them to the rest of the non-European world as French fries. Ironically, because of this latter spread by American fast food chains, in many parts of the non-European world, French fries are sometimes known as American fries. Incidentally, in 1802, Thomas Jefferson had the White House chef, Frenchman Honore Julien, prepare potatoes served in the French manner for a dinner party. He described these as potatoes deep-fried while raw in small cuttings. This is one of the earliest references to fried potato strips being referred to as French. And now for a bonus fact. Parmentier not only championed the potato, but he was also responsible for the first mandatory smallpox vaccination in France in 1805 when he was the Inspector General of the Health Service under Napoleon. Parmentier was also the one who invented the French dish hachis parmentier, a variation of which is also sometimes called shepherd's pie. Hachis parmentier is basically ground beef topped with mashed potatoes and cheese. Variations on this dish include adding gravy, corn, or other vegetables. In addition to the above, Parmentier also founded a school of bread making, was a pioneer in methods for extracting sugar from sugar beets and heavily researched food preservation methods, including refrigeration. And I really hope you found that video fascinating. If you did, please do smash that thumbs up button below. Do not forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.